The flight was almost ready for takeoff. The cabin was quiet save for the soft hum of the engines as passengers settled into their seats. The flight attendant walked through the aisle moving swiftly and purposefully. She was tall and slim, her uniform crisply pressed, but there was a certain tension in the way she moved, a barely perceptible shift in her demeanor. When she reached first class, her eyes swept across the passengers and then paused as she spotted the woman who had just entered the cabin. The woman walked down the aisle with a grace that spoke of confidence. Her black heels clicked against the floor, sharp and assured. She had a calm air about her, but there was something else too, a quiet power. She wasn't just another passenger in first class. She belonged here. The moment she stepped into the space, it was as though the air shifted with her presence. Her gaze met the flight attendant's for just a second, and in that fleeting moment, the attendant's smile faltered, but it went unnoticed by the woman as she took her seat by the window. The businesswoman glanced around, taking in her surroundings. She was used to traveling this way, but there was something about the atmosphere today that felt different. It wasn't just the polished surfaces of the first-class cabin or the expensive decor. It was something in the air, something intangible, as if the others around her were watching her, perhaps even judging her. Without saying a word, she adjusted her suit and settled in for the flight, hoping to relax and catch up on some work. The attendant returned to the woman's row. This time her smile was more rigid, her voice more formal. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Can I offer you something to drink?" The woman nodded politely. "I'll have a glass of water, please," she replied, her voice calm. But something in the way the attendant lingered told her that this was no ordinary interaction. The flight attendant didn't move away quickly as she usually would. She stood there for a moment, almost as if she were waiting for something, but the woman paid it no mind and turned her attention to the window. However, the attendant didn't leave. Instead, she hovered just out of the woman's line of sight, but still close enough to make the woman uncomfortable. It wasn't overt, it was subtle, the way the attendant kept glancing back at her, as if trying to catch her doing something wrong. But the woman chose to ignore it. She had dealt with this kind of treatment before, 1,000 little slights that made her second-guess her place in the world. But she had learned long ago not to let it bother her. She focused on her phone, pulling up some emails to respond to. She couldn't afford to waste time on this flight. She had a meeting to attend in Los Angeles. But even as she typed, her thoughts kept drifting back to the attendant, the way she kept her distance, and yet remained present. The small whispers of doubt that crept into her mind were impossible to shake. She had been traveling for years and had never been made to feel this out of place before. Something wasn't right about the way the attendant was acting. The hum of the engines grew louder as the plane lifted off, but the businesswoman's unease didn't fade. It seemed to settle deeper into her chest. Like a stone sinking into water, she shifted in her seat, trying to get comfortable, but it was difficult, as if something invisible was weighing her down. Her eyes drifted to the attendant, who was now speaking to another passenger across the aisle. She seemed so much warmer with them, more welcoming than she had been with her, and for a moment the businesswoman couldn't help but wonder what was going on. Just as she began to relax again, she heard a small voice rise from beside her. "Mommy, I'm thirsty." It was a soft whimper from her young daughter, who had been quietly napping in her seat. The woman's heart warmed at the sound of her child's voice, but her calm was short-lived as she saw the attendant's eyes snap to her daughter with a sharpness that sent a chill down her spine. The flight attendant's gaze held for a second too long, as if trying to determine whether the child even belonged here at all. The businesswoman turned her attention to her daughter and gently reassured her. "It's okay, baby, we'll get you some water soon." But even as she spoke, she felt the eyes of the flight attendant on them. Her pulse quickened. She couldn't shake the feeling that the attendant was looking at her with suspicion, not just of the situation, but at her as a whole. She had been a frequent flyer for years, but never had she felt so scrutinized, so out of place in this space that was meant for comfort. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, the woman tried to focus on the screen in front of her, but the unease in her chest only seemed to grow stronger. The low hum of the engines was a comforting sound, but not enough to drown out the feeling that something was off. She glanced out the window and then back to the attendant, who had returned to her duties, but there was a shift in the way she moved this time. Her steps were slower and her eyes never left the businesswoman's seat. The woman could feel it, like a weight pressing down on her. She tried to shake it off, but every glance from the attendant seemed to intensify the feeling of being watched. The flight attendants moved down the aisles, once more serving drinks and snacks, but when they reached her row, the woman noticed how the attendant lingered just a little too long in front of her seat. It wasn't obvious to anyone else, but the businesswoman felt it, as if the attendant was trying to catch her doing something wrong. Or maybe it was something more insidious, something the woman couldn't quite put her finger on. Yet the attendant looked at her briefly before turning to offer a drink to the person sitting beside her, a woman who had been chatting happily with the person next to her, as if nothing was wrong. But to the businesswoman it felt like she was being treated differently. The attendant's polite smile never reached her eyes as she handed over the drink to the woman beside her, and when she moved away, she glanced back. Once more, this time the businesswoman noticed the subtle shift in her posture. It was as though the flight attendant was watching her every move, waiting for her to slip up or do something wrong. It was almost as if the woman didn't belong in this space, and it unsettled her to the core. The businesswoman's thoughts were interrupted when her daughter shifted in her seat beside her. The child had been sleeping peacefully for most of the flight, but now her small voice broke the silence again. "Mommy, I need to go potty." The woman smiled softly and reached for her daughter's hand, but before she could speak, the attendant was there again, her figure looming over them like a shadow. "Excuse me," the attendant said with a sharp tone. "She'll need to remain seated at all times, unless she's using the restroom." The woman blinked, surprised by the directness of the request. "She's just asking to use the restroom," she replied evenly, but the attendant didn't seem satisfied. Her eyes darted back to the businesswoman's face, almost as if trying to gauge whether or not she was lying, or if she was hiding something. It was a small thing, but it struck the woman harder than she expected. She had traveled so many times in the past, always treated with courtesy by the flight attendants, but something about this woman's behavior felt colder. Somehow there was an unspoken tension between them now, and the businesswoman could feel it tightening around her like a vice, as if she were being judged for something she hadn't even done yet. But as the attendant walked away, she couldn't help but notice the way she turned back just before disappearing into the galley. Her eyes locked on her for just a second too long, and the feeling of being scrutinized deepened. As the flight continued, the businesswoman found it harder and harder to focus on anything other than the interactions between herself and the flight attendant. She tried to turn her attention back to the emails on her phone, but it felt impossible with the constant nagging feeling that someone was watching her every move. The attendant came by several more times, offering drinks and snacks to the other passengers, but always avoiding her. She felt like a ghost in the cabin, like she was invisible to everyone but the flight attendant, who seemed to see her every movement with a sharpness that made her skin crawl. Then, as the minutes stretched into hours, the unease finally reached its boiling point. The flight attendant stopped in front of her row once again, this time with a tray of snacks. Her expression was unreadable, but the woman could tell she was staring at her now, not at the child, not at the seat, just at her. It was like a quiet battle of wills, without words passing between them. The businesswoman held her gaze for a moment, but then quickly looked away, not wanting to engage with the tension that hung thick in the air. She knew she had to rise above it, not give in to whatever game the attendant was playing, but it was harder than she expected. The unease in her chest spreading further with every glance the attendant took at her. She couldn't explain it, but she felt like she was being tested in some way, as though the attendant were looking for a reason to challenge her, or maybe even to discredit her somehow. But why her out of everyone else in first class? Why was she the target of this subtle hostility? It made no sense. But the more the woman thought about it, the more she realized that this was no accident. This was something personal, something deep-rooted in the way the attendant was perceiving her. The silence in the cabin had deepened. As the hours passed, the flight attendants moved through the aisles, but there was something about the air now. It felt heavier, like a storm was brewing just beneath the surface. Every time the flight attendant walked past, the businesswoman could feel her eyes on her, even if she wasn't looking directly at her. There was this tension, this quiet assessment that felt like an invisible weight pressing down on her chest, and it was making it hard to breathe. It wasn't just the watchful stares, it was the way the attendant seemed to be keeping a distance from her, as if she had made a judgment, and now she was just waiting to see if the woman would prove her right or wrong. The businesswoman felt every glance, as if they were needles pricking at her skin, and despite herself she couldn't shake the feeling that the attendant was waiting for something to happen, waiting for her to make a mistake, or show that she didn't belong in the first-class cabin. But why was she being singled out? It didn't make sense. She had flown hundreds of times before, always treated with respect and courtesy. But today everything felt different today. She felt like an outsider in a place she should have been comfortable in. Her daughter sat beside her, quietly playing with the small toy she had brought along, but the woman couldn't shake the feeling that the tension in the air was growing even thicker every minute that passed. It was as though everyone on the plane could sense it too, though no one dared to say anything. Even the other passengers in first class seemed to sense the subtle shift in the atmosphere. They were whispering among themselves, casting occasional glances toward the woman and her daughter. But no one spoke out loud, no one dared to break the silence. But it was clear the businesswoman was the center of attention, whether she liked it or not. And then it happened. The flight attendant walked past again, but this time she stopped just at the edge of the woman's seat. Her eyes flicked to the woman's daughter, and for a moment she seemed to hesitate, as if unsure of how to proceed. But then she spoke, her voice cold and controlled. "I'm afraid children aren't allowed to make too much noise in first class." The words hit the woman like a slap. She hadn't expected it. Her daughter hadn't been making any noise. She was just quietly playing with her toy. The businesswoman's eyes flicked to her daughter to reassure her, but then she looked back at the attendant, trying to keep her voice steady. "She's not disturbing anyone," she said, but the attendant's eyes didn't soften. They remained hard and judgmental. The tension in the air thickened. It felt like the whole cabin was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. The woman could feel the heat rising in her chest, the anger that was building up like a storm waiting to erupt. She was a businesswoman, a professional who had earned her place here in first class, and yet she was being treated like she didn't belong, like she was a disruption in a space she had every right to be in. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the issue wasn't her behavior, it wasn't her daughter's behavior either. It was the way she was being perceived by the flight attendant, as if she had been marked from the moment she stepped onto the plane. The woman's heart raced as she tried to keep her composure. She wasn't about to let this woman get under her skin. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized this wasn't just about a flight. This was about something bigger, something deeper. It wasn't just the attendant's judgment. It was the way she was being made to feel like she didn't belong, like she wasn't worthy of the respect and dignity that everyone else in first class seemed to be afforded. It was subtle, but it was there, a quiet undercurrent of discrimination that she couldn't ignore. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself as the attendant moved away. But the anger didn't subside. It festered just below the surface. She glanced around the cabin, once again feeling the weight of the stares of the other passengers. She could feel their eyes on her. Even though they said nothing, it was as if they were all in on something. She wasn't part of some unspoken rule that she didn't know about. And that realization hit her hard, because it made her wonder just how often this kind of thing happened, how often people were treated this way and never spoke up. The more she thought about it, the more she realized this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding or an accident. This was a deliberate choice. The flight attendant was making a statement, and it wasn't about the child or the noise. It was about who she thought the businesswoman was, who she assumed she was, and why she didn't think she belonged there. The woman's mind raced as she considered her options. She could ignore it. She could let it slide and continue on with the flight. But something inside her pushed back against that idea. Something told her she couldn't just let this go, not without saying something, not without standing up for herself and her daughter, not without showing this flight attendant that she wasn't going to be treated like an outsider. The businesswoman sat frozen in her seat, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. She couldn't understand why she was being treated like this. It didn't make sense. There were so many other passengers on the flight, so many other people in first class who were just as deserving of attention and respect. Yet somehow she had become the target of something she couldn't quite explain. Every glance from the flight attendant felt like a judgment. Every movement felt deliberate, as if the woman was waiting for her to slip up, waiting for her to prove that she didn't belong here, that she wasn't good enough to be in the space she had earned. The flight continued on in silence. and though the businesswoman tried to focus on something else, her thoughts kept circling back to the flight attendant, and the treatment she had received, the way the attendant's eyes lingered on her and her daughter, as if they were out of place, as if they didn't fit the image of what a first-class passenger should look like. The woman's heart beat faster as the frustration built within her. She had dealt with these small insults before, but never in a place like this, never in a space where she was supposed to be treated with the utmost respect. Her daughter shifted again beside her, fidgeting in her seat, and the businesswoman reached over to comfort her. Without even thinking, she gently stroked her daughter's hair, but the movement caught the eye of the flight attendant once again, who had been hovering at the front of the cabin. Her eyes locked onto them. The moment they made contact, the businesswoman felt the heat rise in her chest. The air around her seemed to tighten as the flight attendant walked toward them, her footsteps measured and slow, her gaze never leaving the woman's face. When the attendant finally reached their row, the tension in the air felt unbearable. The woman could almost feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, even though they didn't dare speak. The silence was deafening, and she knew that all eyes were on her. The attendant stopped in front of them, her hands folded in front of her, her face a mask of politeness. But the businesswoman could see the coldness in her eyes, the thin veneer of courtesy that was barely holding back the judgment that lay just beneath the surface. "Excuse me, ma'am," the attendant said, her voice clipped and formal. "I notice that your daughter is still playing with her toy. She'll need to put it away. It's causing the disturbance." The words cut through the silence like a blade. The businesswoman's blood ran cold. Her daughter hadn't made a sound. She hadn't caused any disturbance at all. But the flight attendant's words felt like an accusation. The woman opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She felt trapped, like she was being backed into a corner. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't about the toy or her daughter's behavior. This was about something far deeper, something that the flight attendant wasn't saying outright, but was clearly present in every glance, every action. She finally found her voice. "She's not causing any disturbance," the woman said, her voice steady, but there was an edge to it now. She could feel the tension building in her chest, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could hold it. And the flight attendant's eyes flickered with a brief flash of something almost like surprise, but it quickly faded into something colder, something more calculating. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she looked down at the child, as if assessing the situation for a moment. And when she finally looked back up at the businesswoman, there was something in her gaze that made the woman's skin crawl. It was a look that said she was being judged for something she couldn't control, something about her that the attendant had already decided was wrong. The businesswoman's pulse quickened as she realized the true weight of what was happening. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It wasn't just one rude flight attendant. It was the feeling of being judged, constantly scrutinized for her very presence, as if she didn't belong in this space, as if the fact that she was sitting here in first class was some sort of mistake. It was the same feeling she had experienced all throughout her life, the feeling of being an outsider. No matter how hard she tried to fit in, no matter how much she achieved, no matter how much she succeeded, there was always someone ready to remind her that she didn't belong. And now it was happening again, here of all places. The woman took a deep breath, fighting the wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. She looked at her daughter, who was still quietly sitting beside her, oblivious to the tension swirling around them. She felt a surge of protectiveness rise within her. She wouldn't let this woman make her or her daughter feel small. She wouldn't let anyone tell them they didn't belong. She had worked too hard to get to this point. She had fought too many battles to let this be another one that passed without standing up for herself and her daughter. "My daughter is not a disturbance," she said firmly, her voice rising just a bit louder than before. "And I'm not going to tolerate being treated like I don't belong here." The words hung in the air, heavy with defiance. The flight attendant's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that the businesswoman couldn't quite read, but it was enough to make her heart race with anticipation. The moment the words left her mouth, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath for just a split second. It was as if time had frozen, and every eye in first class turned to watch the scene unfold. The flight attendant stood motionless, her face unreadable, but her eyes flickered with something colder now. It wasn't just surprise, it was something deeper, something harder. The businesswoman's heart raced as she stared back at the attendant. She could feel the anger rising in her chest. But she refused to back down. She wasn't going to let this woman make her feel small. She wasn't going to let her daughter see her back down from this challenge. The flight attendant's lips barely moved as she spoke, but the words cut through the tension like a knife. "Ma'am, I'm just trying to ensure the comfort of all passengers. I understand you're upset, but you need to understand that noise in first class is unacceptable." The woman could feel her blood boil the way the attendant's voice was dripping with false politeness. It was clear this wasn't about noise. This wasn't about her daughter's toy or any disturbance. This was something else. It was a judgment on who she was and where she belonged, and that was something she couldn't ignore any longer. Comfort. The businesswoman repeated the word like a bitter taste on her tongue. "This is about comfort. You're telling me that my daughter can't even play quietly without being called a disturbance." Her voice was rising now, her words coming faster. The anger that had been building inside her for hours now erupted, and she wasn't about to apologize for it. The flight attendant's expression hardened even more, and for a moment the businesswoman thought she saw a flicker of disdain in her eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Ma'am, please calm down," the flight attendant said with a forced smile, but the businesswoman could hear the edge in her voice. Now the attempt at control was slipping. The tension was too thick. It was palpable, and the other passengers in first class had stopped pretending not to notice. They were watching now, murmuring among themselves. The businesswoman knew they were all waiting for her to back down, to let the flight attendant win, but she couldn't, she wouldn't. She took a deep breath and steadied herself. She was done playing the game. She was done letting this woman try to make her feel like she didn't deserve to be here. "You're not going to treat me like this," she said firmly, locking eyes with the attendant. The words were final now. There was no going back. The entire cabin seemed to shift in response to the sudden change in the air. It was as if they were all holding their collective breath, waiting to see how the flight attendant would respond. For a long moment there was silence, and then the flight attendant spoke again. This time her voice was lower, her words sharp. "Ma'am, you need to understand your behavior is inappropriate," she said, her gaze never leaving the woman's face. "If you continue to cause a scene, I'll be forced to ask you to leave the plane when we land." The threat hung in the air, but it didn't have the same power it might have had before. The businesswoman was no longer afraid of it. She could see right through the empty words the flight attendant was using to assert control, and it made her blood boil even more. The businesswoman stood up suddenly, her hands gripping the seat in front of her for support. She was no longer going to sit idly by. She was no longer going to shrink back into her seat and let this woman intimidate her. She turned to the passengers in the rows around her. "Is this how you all feel too?" she asked, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Is this how we're going to let someone treat us for no reason?" The cabin fell silent again. The passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one said anything. The flight attendant's gaze never wavered. She was trying to regain control of the situation, but the woman had taken it back now. She could feel the power shift in the room, and it felt good. It felt empowering to stand up to this woman who had tried to make her feel inferior. Her daughter tugged gently at her sleeve. "Mommy, why is she being mean?" The soft voice cut through the tension, and the woman looked down at her child, who was staring up at her with wide eyes. The question was simple, but it struck the woman deeply. It was a question she hadn't been able to answer for herself yet. Why was the flight attendant being mean? Why was she being treated like this? The answer didn't make sense, but as the woman looked back at the flight attendant, she knew it was more than just a misunderstanding. It was about something bigger, something much more complicated than a flight, or a seat, or a toy. It was about the assumptions that people made about her, and how she was treated based on those assumptions. She turned back to the attendant, her voice steady now. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to let you push me around." The words were final, and there was no hesitation in her tone. The flight attendant stood there for a moment, as if weighing her options, but then she spoke again. This time her voice was quieter, but it still carried the same sense of authority. "You're making a mistake," the attendant said, but the woman could see the cracks in her facade. The control she had once held was slipping, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, the businesswoman felt a small sense of victory wash over her. The flight attendant's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't respond right away. Instead, she stood there for a moment as if trying to process what had just happened. It was clear she hadn't expected the businesswoman to fight back, and that moment of hesitation made the businesswoman feel a flicker of hope. The tension in the air seemed to thicken with every passing second. The other passengers were watching now. They were no longer pretending to be unaware. They were waiting for the next move, waiting to see if the businesswoman would continue to stand her ground, or if the attendant would find a way to overpower her. The attendant's posture stiffened as she took a step back. She didn't look at the other passengers or the businesswoman's daughter. She just focused on the woman herself, and when she spoke again, it was with a forced calmness. "Ma'am, if you refuse to cooperate, I'll be forced to report this incident." The words were almost mechanical now, no longer carrying the same bite they had earlier, but there was still a clear sense of authority in her voice. It was the kind of authority that tried to mask fear by sounding confident, but the businesswoman could see through it. She could feel the cracks forming in the flight attendant's control, and it gave her a surge of confidence. The businesswoman glanced around at the other passengers. They were still silent. Some had leaned forward slightly as if they were waiting for her to make the next move, but no one was willing to speak up for her. No one was willing to step in and stand against the flight attendant. Even though they all knew something wasn't right, it was a moment that felt deeply isolating, like she was the only one who cared enough to speak out against the injustice happening in front of her. She could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her shoulders, but instead of feeling smaller, she felt her resolve grow stronger. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about standing up for something bigger than herself. "Report it then," the woman said, her voice steady but full of determination. She wasn't backing down now. She had already come this far, and there was no turning back. "You can report it all you want, but I'm not going to let you treat me like this. I'm not going to let you bully me or my daughter." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, she felt a shift in the atmosphere. It was subtle, but she could sense it. It was as if the other passengers were starting to understand that this wasn't just a petty disagreement. This was about the way people in power tried to control and intimidate others based on their assumptions. The flight attendant didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced down at the woman's daughter, who had been quiet for most of the conversation. But now her small face looked up at the attendant with wide, innocent eyes. The contrast between the child's innocence and the tension that filled the cabin was stark, and it made the businesswoman's heart ache. For a moment, she wanted to protect her daughter from all of this, but she knew she couldn't back down. Not now, not when the stakes were this high. "You're making a scene," the flight attendant finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, but the words still carried the weight of accusation, as if it was the woman's fault that everything had escalated. But the businesswoman wasn't fazed by the words. She had heard this kind of thing before. People always tried to make her feel like she was the one in the wrong for speaking up, for standing up for herself. It was a tired argument, one that never held any real weight anymore. "I'm not making a scene," the woman said calmly. "You are." She took a step closer to the attendant, now the two of them standing face to face, the intensity in the air almost tangible. The businesswoman could feel her heartbeat quicken, but she stood tall. She refused to let the attendant intimidate her any longer. The flight attendant looked like she was about to say something else, but before she could, the captain's voice came over the intercom, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been made aware of a situation in first class, and we ask that everyone remain calm and in your seats for the duration of the flight." The voice was smooth and calm, but the message was clear. The captain had been alerted to what was going on, and now the entire cabin was on edge. The businesswoman could feel the eyes of every passenger on her. Even though no one had said a word, everyone was watching now. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The attendant's gaze flickered toward the front of the cabin for a split second before she turned back to the woman, her expression hardening again. "This isn't over," she said through gritted teeth. But the businesswoman didn't flinch. She simply stood her ground, waiting for the attendant to make the next move. Her daughter was still holding her hand quietly, but the woman could feel the small fingers trembling just a little. She squeezed her daughter's hand, gently reassuring her without saying a word. The flight attendant backed away slowly, her eyes never leaving the businesswoman's face. But the power dynamic had shifted, something had broken in that moment, and the businesswoman could feel it. She knew she had taken the first step toward reclaiming control over the situation, the first step toward demanding the respect she deserved, even if it wasn't going to come easily. The attendant turned on her heel and walked back down the aisle without a word, her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the cabin, and as she disappeared behind the curtain, the businesswoman let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time she felt like she had taken control of her own narrative, and no one was going to take that away from her. The businesswoman sat back down in her seat, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline that still coursed through her veins. She looked at her daughter, who was still holding her hand quietly, but there was a new look in her eyes, a look that said she understood something had changed, something was different now. But the woman wasn't sure whether it was a victory or just another step in a long battle. She glanced around the cabin. Once again, the silence was deafening. No one spoke, no one dared to break the quiet. But she could feel the weight of all those stares on her. The moment the flight attendant had walked away, they had all shifted their attention back to their own business. But there was something different now, something unspoken. It felt like the entire cabin was holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. She tried to calm herself, to steady her thoughts, but the anger that had flared earlier hadn't fully gone away. It was still there, just beneath the surface, waiting for another spark to ignite it. The feeling of injustice was thick in the air, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something else was at play here, something bigger than just a confrontation over a toy or a misunderstanding about behavior. It was about the way people like her were treated differently, and how their worth was questioned even in spaces where they belonged. Her daughter tugged at her hand again, this time looking up at her with wide eyes. "Mommy, is she mad at us?" The question was simple, but it hit the woman harder than anything else she'd been asked today. Her daughter's innocence was like a sharp reminder of everything she had fought to protect. She looked at her daughter and forced a smile. She didn't want her to feel the weight of the situation. She didn't want her to see how much this had hurt, but the truth was it was hard not to. "No, sweetheart," she said softly. "She's not mad at us, she's just confused, but we're going to be okay." The words came out like a promise, but she wasn't sure if she believed them herself. She had never been one to shy away from confrontation. But this felt different. It felt personal. It felt like something that was beyond just a bad experience on a flight. It felt like a reminder that no matter how far she had come, no matter how successful she had been, there would always be someone who saw her and her daughter as less than. The captain's voice came through the intercom again, this time with a slight change in tone. It was clear that the situation had escalated further. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're approaching our destination. We ask that you remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we land." The announcement was polite, but there was an underlying tension in it now, a sense of urgency that hadn't been there before. It was as if everyone on board was aware of what had just transpired, and no one was sure how it would end. The businesswoman felt her heart rate pick up as they began their descent. The thought of landing and facing whatever awaited them on the ground made her stomach turn. She wasn't afraid, but she was uncertain. She didn't know what kind of reaction she would get from the airline, or from the other passengers, or even from the flight attendant herself, who had been so determined to make her feel small. But now she could almost sense that the attendant was unsure of herself. Too, the power had shifted, and for the first time she could see the cracks in the facade, the cracks in the control the attendant had once wielded so effortlessly. Her daughter leaned in closer, resting her head on her shoulder. As the plane began its descent, the woman closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself relax just a little. Despite everything she had been through, there was a strange sense of peace in that small moment, in the quiet hum of the plane and the soft warmth of her daughter's head against her. She thought about how much she had fought for this moment, how much she had fought for herself, and for her daughter to be treated with dignity and respect, and how in that fight she had found strength she never knew she had. The plane touched down, and the sound of the wheels hitting the runway sent a jolt of tension through the cabin. As the plane began to taxi toward the gate, The businesswoman could feel her stomach tighten again. She wasn't sure what would happen once they disembarked. Would the flight attendant approach her again? Would there be more confrontation? Or would this be over? She didn't know, but one thing was certain: this experience had changed her. She had stood up for herself and her daughter, and she had made it clear that no one was going to treat them like they didn't belong. As the plane came to a stop, and the seatbelt sign flickered off, the businesswoman slowly unbuckled her seatbelt. She could hear the shuffle of passengers getting ready to disembark. But she wasn't in any hurry. She took one last look around the cabin. This time, she wasn't worried about the stares. She didn't care what anyone else thought, because she knew she had done what she needed to do. And in that moment, that was enough. She would walk off this plane with her head held high, knowing that she had not let anyone make her feel less than. The flight attendant appeared again as passengers began to stand up. She was moving quickly now, not making eye contact with the businesswoman, as if she was trying to pretend nothing had happened. But the businesswoman could see the tension in her shoulders, the unease in the way she moved. It was clear the attendant was avoiding her, and for a moment the businesswoman felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. She had stood her ground. She had faced the judgment and come out on top. She wasn't just a passenger on this flight. She was someone who deserved to be there and who had fought for that right. As the businesswoman stood up and gathered her things, she could feel the weight of the flight attendant's gaze on her. But this time it didn't matter. She wasn't afraid anymore. The moment the seatbelt sign went off, the other passengers began to move toward the exits, but she stayed still for a moment, her daughter still beside her, looking up with that quiet trust in her eyes. The kind of trust that only a child can have, the kind of trust that reminded her why she had to do this, why she had to stand up for herself and for her daughter. The woman took a deep breath as she stood up and walked toward the aisle, feeling the eyes of the passengers on her. But this time it felt different. She felt empowered in a way she hadn't expected when she first boarded the flight. The flight attendant was at the front of the cabin now, directing passengers with a forced smile, her posture stiff, as if she were trying to act as if nothing had happened. The businesswoman could see through it, though. She could see the nervous energy in the attendant's movements, the way she avoided eye contact with her, almost as if she were ashamed. But the businesswoman wasn't interested in any apology. She wasn't going to let the attendant's discomfort become her burden. She had done what she needed to do, and she wasn't going to let anyone make her feel small again. As they approached the door to exit the plane, the businesswoman hesitated for a moment, her daughter's small hand in hers, a soft voice in her ear, reminding her how important this moment was, not just for them, but for everyone who had been watching and witnessing the injustice unfold, for everyone who was too afraid to speak up. She knew that the flight attendant's actions might not change today, but she also knew that standing up in moments like this was part of a bigger fight, a fight that would continue beyond this flight, beyond this moment. It was a fight for dignity, for respect, and for the right to be seen as equals. Just as they reached the exit door, the captain was standing by the threshold. He was tall and calm, his uniform immaculate, as he made eye contact with her for the first time since the incident began. "Ma'am, I want to thank you for your patience today," he said, his voice warm, but also a little uncertain, as though he had been briefed about what had happened, but didn't quite know what to say. She was surprised by the sincerity in his tone. It wasn't the apology she had expected, but it was something that felt like an acknowledgement, a recognition that something wrong had occurred. She nodded slowly, her eyes locked with his. "I appreciate that," she said, her voice steady and firm. She wasn't looking for an apology from him, but she could tell he was genuinely trying to make up for the awkwardness of the situation. The captain glanced down at her daughter and smiled briefly before stepping aside to allow them to pass. As she stepped off the plane and into the terminal, the businesswoman felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion wash over her. The ordeal was finally over, but she knew that the impact of it would stay with her for a long time. She glanced down at her daughter, who was still holding her hand, her small face now bright with curiosity about the airport surroundings, and for a moment she allowed herself to relax. She wasn't going to let this experience define her or her daughter. It was just one moment in a much bigger story, one chapter in their lives that had been filled with far more triumphs than struggles. They walked together toward the baggage claim area, the woman's mind already drifting back to the bigger picture. She thought about how important it was to teach her daughter the value of standing up for herself, no matter how uncomfortable or difficult it might be. She thought about how her own journey had led her to this point, where she could face conflict head-on, without flinching, without being afraid of what others might think or say. This wasn't just a flight. This wasn't just an interaction with one rude flight attendant. This was about how far she had come and how much she had grown. As they reached the baggage carousel and the conveyor belt began to turn, the woman let out a quiet sigh of relief. It was over. They had made it through together. They were okay. She didn't need the approval of anyone else to know that what she had done was right. She had done what was necessary for herself and for her daughter, and that was all that mattered. The businesswoman glanced down at her daughter and smiled, a soft but genuine smile that was full of quiet pride, because in that moment she knew they were stronger than they had been before. They had faced an obstacle and come out the other side unbroken, and in the end, that was all she could ever ask for. As they made their way out of the airport and into the fresh air of the city, she looked up at the sky, feeling a sense of quiet triumph. It wasn't just about winning a confrontation. It was about reclaiming her power, her sense of self, and teaching her daughter that no one, no matter how much authority they had, could ever make her feel less than she was, worthy of the respect and dignity every person deserved.